I'll share something really funny. So when I was doing the Boston Marathon a few weeks ago, this guy said Sat Sri Akal to me, this runner, right? He's like, Sat
Mhm.
Sri Akal. I'm like, oh, Sat Sri Akal. And this other person, he's like, Vaiguru, right? So I wonder if they had seen your TikTok videos or Instagram videos, and perhaps they learned from that.
Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Hello, everyone. My name is Navpreet Singh. You may know me as Nav the Poet. Welcome to the first episode of the Rooted in Sikhi podcast, where I have conversations with fellow Sikhs to discuss the role our Sikhi plays in navigating the world. I'm so honored to have my first guest. He's a friend of mine, and I'm really excited to talk to him. But let me first put a little disclaimer. So the views expressed are those of the speaker and do not reflect the official policy or position of the U.S. Army, Department of Defense, U.S. government, National Guard, Massachusetts National Guard, or Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Now, Kanwar Singh is a digital technologist and signal officer in the Massachusetts Army National Guard. He has led the development of AI-enabled mobile and IoT products that have a dual use in military, healthcare, academia, and finance. Singh is the co-author of a financial accounting textbook and is taught as a finance accounting instructor at Harvard University. Please welcome AI technologist and Army officer Kanwar Singh. How you doing, Kanwar?
I'm doing just fine now. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be on this podcast series.
Yeah, thank you for joining me. This idea we had of just having a conversation to discuss Sikhs in the military really sparked this idea of starting a podcast. So I kind of have you to thank for this. So yeah, if you could just really quickly introduce yourself to the audience.
Sure. So I live in Boston. I serve in the Massachusetts Army National Guard as a first lieutenant. I am a technologist on the civilian side. I've had a long journey trying to join the military as a Sikh. I'm so happy to talk about that, and people love hearing that story because it ends up inspiring them, and that's my hope, right? As if people can learn one thing from my experience, that is, do not give up, do not quit, keep going down the path you're passionate about, and the world would be better off for that.
Awesome. Love it. Okay, so we're just going to dive right into it. First off, what has your journey with Sikhi been like? Have you always practiced? Did you follow it from birth? Tell me about that.
Yeah. So look, I was born in a Sikh family, and so at the time, I didn't really think a whole lot about Sikhi. So I grew up in Delhi and lived there for the first 17 years of my life. And so, certainly end up going to Gurdwara on the weekends and doing Langar Seva and listening to Kirtan. I have never cut my hair nor shaved. I've always had a turban, a patka or a turban on. But I didn't really think a whole lot about that until I actually moved to the US. And even moving to the US at the age of 17, thinking about Sikhi wasn't necessarily a big part of my life. I think one of the first times I really thought about myself as a Sikh was as a Sikh American was when the tragedy happened in Oak Creek, Wisconsin. I remember being at a Gurdwara in Richmond, Virginia at the time, and started seeing alerts on my phone that there had been a shooting at a Sikh Gurdwara. And I was shocked because that could have been me, that could have been my family. And that's when I realized that because of my Sikh identity, my family and I, my community and I could be under threat. And that's really when I think I became more active in the Sikh community in the US and joining organizations and attending conferences that helped me understand what my journey and my role could be as a Sikh American. So during that time, and this is in 2014, I was actually in Washington, D.C., and there was a briefing being held on Sikhs in America at the White House. And I remember thinking at the time that here I am as a Sikh American, I pay my taxes and contribute to the society, but I could not join our nation's military. And I realized in that moment that this was a very flawed policy that exists. Now, just to be clear, Sikhs have served in the US military for over 100 years now. Bhagat Singh Thind, the legendary Bhagat Singh Thind, was one of the first Sikhs to serve in the US Army, and he actually fought in World War One, wearing U.S. Army's uniform and with his Sikh Articles of Faith back in 1918, right? So it's not like Sikhs have been new to military service, as you're very familiar enough. Sikhs have been in military service throughout our history because it was not just a fun thing to do, but it was a means of surviving when we were being attacked, right? And so our gurus even encouraged us to get trained in martial arts and learn how to use weapons so we could defend ourselves, but also people around us. So I remember being at the briefing and I said, this is just so wrong and someone needs to fix it. And then the next thing I asked myself is, what am I doing to fix it myself? Because I feel like that happens a lot in society, right? We see things and we're like, yeah, someone needs to go fix it. But then we don't end up doing anything about it ourselves because we always think someone else is going to do it for us, right? So in that moment, and look, I've also had some history of military service in my family. My great grandfather were both in the British Sikh regiments, and so military service, and this is common for a lot of Sikhs. If we go back in our history, I think the vast majority of Sikhs would find that somewhere in their family lineage, someone was in the military, right? So for someone like us and the warrior ethos we have as a community to be excluded from military service, I just felt it was discriminatory and it was wrong. And I didn't know what I was signing up for at the time, but I realized that if there was someone who was going to do it, it was going to be me. And look, I was also in graduate school at the time, so I, had more flexibility. I could take certain risks that I would not take now, for example. So I said, hey, what's the worst that can happen, right? The military is going to say no. So what? I'll probably have another career. I mean, the military has never been a primary career for me, and I'm very grateful for that because for some people, military is the only career choice that they have. And so they would not be able to, for example, take the amount of risks that I could for someone who also had other career opportunities. So I felt, all right, I reached out to some, friends and colleagues at Sikh Coalition, and I said, listen, sign me up. I want to go through this process. Call me crazy. And they went through a vetting process, and they're asking you all kinds of questions just to ensure that you'll be a good client of theirs. And so I went through that, and they were very generous enough to represent me pro bono and be there with me. And so I'd highly recommend everyone listening to take a look at Sikh Coalition, because I'm a huge advocate of the organization and the work they continue to do to help not just Sikhs like myself who serve in the military, but also other Sikhs in other professions who may be struggling with getting religious accommodations that they've been unable to get. So long story short, it took a lot of persuasion, support from members of Congress and senators, and they ended up endorsing my right to serve. And I was able to enlist in August of 2015.
Wow. And we're going to get more into your story and your experience. But before we do, I wanted to, you touched a little with Bhagat Singh Thind, but I wanted you to discuss maybe a little more of what you know about the history of Sikhs and military service.
Yeah. Look, so if we look at Sikhs, as I'm sure you're aware now, but perhaps your audience is not, the Sikh community, we've gone through a lot of cycles of oppression throughout our history. There have been multiple genocide conducted against the Sikh community. In fact, in the 17th and 18th century, close to 1/3 to 1/2 of the Sikh community was wiped out because the rulers at the time did not like Sikhs and our freedoms and what the religion stood for, which was equality of all people and justice for all, and fighting and standing out against societal oppression. And our unwillingness to pay taxes because we would not convert to other faiths. So throughout that time, I think one of the biggest lessons for the Sikh community was we have to learn how to defend ourselves and be warriors, because if we don't, folks will attack us and kill us and take away our right to practice our religion. And so that practice continues to this day. If you look at wherever Sikhs are around the world, we serve in overwhelming numbers. You look at India, Canada, UK, Australia, New Zealand, France, US, right? I mean, wherever you have Sikh communities, we volunteer to sign up. And look, I do think, the Sikh community also has some advantages because we tend to be more rugged and for example, taller, bigger, right? So there's some advantages like that I think Sikhs have that also makes it, easier for us to serve. But with that being said, I think we also have this warrior mindset, right? So you look at Guru Gobind Singh Ji and what he taught about never giving up and the Char Sahibzade and the wars they were involved in and the struggle they were involved in. And then from that, you continue on and the greatest last stand in military history, which I'm very passionate to talk about, not just as a Sikh, but also as a signal officer in the army, is the Battle of Saraguri, which was fought on September 12th, 1897, right? 21 Sikhs against 10,000 Afghans. And whenever I share that story with people, who are in the military or outside, they're always perplexed by that, right? Because I think for most people, if they were part of the 21, they probably would have quit. They would have surrendered. They would have tried to figure out how do you get out of that situation. But the 21 Sikhs who were led by Havildar Ishar Singh did not quit, right? They're like, listen, we are Sikhs. If we don't quit, we're going to fight until the end. We have to. And I'm glad they did because not only did they keep the mission first, but they set such a strong legacy for the rest of Sikhs to follow. And I think it continues to define who Sikhs are. Sikhs are known. If people know who Sikhs are, they recognize us for two things. A, that we are peace-loving people who love to give back and serve others. And the fact that we are warriors and we don't quit and we don't give up. That's part of our branding, right?
Yes.
And rightly or wrongly. And a lot of that started with Guru Gobind Singh Ji and then the training that Sikhs received since then, and then what the 21 Sikhs did in Battle of Saraguri and other battles that Sikhs have been involved in since then. So.
Yeah, I mean, like one of my favorite historical moments is the Chali Mukte in Mai Pago. And, a devout Sikh woman who, when 46 abandoned their guru, she picked up a sword and said, no, that's not what we're doing here. And they felt so ashamed of that they followed her, and they got caught in this fierce battle where the 40 of them died. And I know you know this, but just for anybody that doesn't, they died in serving their guru. Even though they made that mistake of abandoning him, they eventually, made up for it, and that's why they're called the Chali Mukte, the 40 liberated ones. And something I didn't learn till more recently is apparently Mai Pago became a bodyguard for Guru Gobind Singh Ji, which is just,
that's right.
It's just, I love it. And yeah, so of course there's so much history that we could just do a whole episode on, honestly. So you talked about wanting to make that change, be that change. You realize there should be a change and you need to be it. And so you got this endorsement from the Sikh Coalition. And then I'm assuming that there wasn't an immediate acceptance for your articles for the Sikh, the Star and everything. So when that happened, when that pushback came, did you ever consider cutting your hair to join? Did you have that issue of what do I do?
Yeah, no, great question here. Now, so first off, I never, agreed to cut my hair. And I knew that from the beginning, right? I mean, again, that's something we don't do as Sikhs. And so I just felt it was discriminatory, un-American for our own government and our own military to prevent Sikhs from serving. Despite our long-standing history of military service. And so I just thought that was just so... With the stars on. Yeah. I mean, you look at Sikhs who fought very bravely on the front lines in both World War I, World War II. I mean, they were considered some of the best warriors. The British, for example, whenever they had tough battles, they were sending Sikhs up front, right? They're like, there's a group of people we can rely upon to get the job done. It has to be the Sikhs, right? So I just thought it was just wrong that our own government would try to prevent qualified, eligible Americans who could meet all our high standards from serving. So after I enlisted, which I thought was a miracle in itself, I did not expect that to happen. So I woke up and I'm like, is this thing really happening? Because I had, up until that point, gotten so many rejections from the military. So I think my own count is around 14 times I was officially rejected.
Wow.
Before I signed the dotted line in August 2015.
And sorry, was it specifically because of the wanting to keep your
Yeah.
Oh, Sikhi. Oh, that's why. So it wasn't like, oh, you didn't meet other standards. It was just because of, wow.
So the issue from the military, which I understand why what was happening, was we have a policy for everything. So we have AR 670-1, which is Army's regulation on appearance and grooming standards. And so it said specifically in it at the time that you had to be clean shaven and you could not have long hair. And there was no policy that would allow for religious accommodation. Now, the military had given some very selective accommodations up until then. So there's cases of Lieutenant Colonel Kalsi and Lieutenant Colonel Ratan and Corporal Lamba. These were doctors, dentists, and a medic who had gotten religious accommodations in mid to late 2000s. But that was it. If you were just a regular soldier like I was hoping to become, there was no process to get a religious accommodation, right? So somehow, again, as I said, they allowed me to sign the enlistment paperwork, and then I signed the dotted line. And the big question mark then was, what happens now? Because at that time, the military could have legally ordered me to cut my hair and shave, and I certainly would have refused it, and they could have put me in jail. That was my biggest fear. I'm like, that's one of the only reasons I was hesitating to sign the enlistment documents, because I wasn't sure what was going to happen afterwards, right? This was uncharted territory. And I told our legal team at Sikh Coalition, I'm like, I'm kind of nervous, not because I don't believe in the cause, but I don't want to be in jail because I know if they ask me to cut my hair and shave, I'm going to voluntarily refuse it. Right. And so what happens after that? So we, and they had similar concerns, but we are like, hey, we don't know. And that's why, I took a step back and I said, all right, what I would do as a Sikh is not give up in the face of adversity, and you just keep moving forward.
Yeah.
But I also had confidence in my legal team that if something were to happen, they'll come get me out. So we were prepared for all eventualities. So what happened was so I submitted an official application for an accommodation after I enlisted. And so I had a series of interviews with my chain of command, with my chaplain. We had a lot of paperwork we had to submit. But the Pentagon just sat on it, right? Without me knowing anything about what's going to happen next. I did know after I signed the contract in August of 2015 that I was supposed to ship off for basic training in May of 2016. And so we had done that for a reason. We didn't want to rush through it. And the recruiter basically said, let's try to give you as much time because we don't know how long this whole religious accommodation process is going to take. Right. In the meantime, as a member of the National Guard, I was still supposed to show up for drills. And so my unit would not allow me to drill with the rest of the unit because they're like, hey, having him with a beard, turban, long hair, that's going to impact morale and unit cohesion, and we just cannot allow that. So I was segregated from my unit, and I was coming in the middle of the week and literally shredding paper, right? I mean, nothing wrong with just coming in and, paying, getting paid to shred paper, but that's not why I had signed up to do the job. I wanted to get trained as a soldier, and so the rest of the unit was getting some great training, and I was not. In fact, they would not even issue me a military ID card at the time because they're like, we don't know, we don't know if we can give you a military ID card because we don't even know you're official. Even though I had signed the contract that every recruit signs, and I was eligible for a military ID, and I was eligible to get some uniforms that they were issuing other recruits. So none of that, was being done. And all of this, by the way, is public information now, because I'll get to this in a second, but we ended up having to file a lawsuit. But before I talk about the lawsuit, in December of 2015, Secretary of Defense Ash Carter came and did a speech at the Harvard Kennedy School. And so I think you mentioned in the bio, I was teaching there at the time, and I was also a student there. And I'm like, hey, why don't I go ask Secretary of Defense Ash Carter what he thinks about Sikhs in the military? And
Smart.
knowing what I know now about chain of command and the military, I would not have done that, right? Because I was a very low-ranking soldier,
Right.
and for someone like me to go up to my boss's 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 boss, because there's a bunch of people between me and him at the time, and just ask him in a very public setting what he thought about Sikhs in the military. I mean, look, I was putting myself at severe career risk, but I had no career at the time.
Right.
So I didn't really care, frankly.
Yeah.
I mean, I thought, hey, what's the worst that could happen? They'll probably discharge me for, going and asking a question to Secretary Ash Carter. All right, that's fine. So what? I mean, we tried, right? So I asked him, and you can find a video of this on YouTube, but I asked him a public question in front of 1,000 people. There was probably another 1,000 people watching that event live. And by the way, some of the people in the audience were my friends, my colleagues. I was also fearful that Harvard University might fire me for throwing this question at the Secretary of Defense. But I'm like, okay, I'll get fired from Harvard. So what? I'll probably find another job. So I asked him a question, and he was, by the way, very diplomatic and very supportive. And he talked about Harjit Sajjan, which I don't know if you know, or some of your audience listening in doesn't know or not, but Harjit Sajjan was at the time newly appointed as Canada's defense minister, and he happened to be Sikh, and Harjit Sajjan actually had served with the U.S. forces in the Middle East. So he talked about Harjit Sajjan and how Harjit Sajjan is his friend, and Harjit Sajjan was able to serve in the Canadian forces with his Sikh articles of faith, and we should allow Sikhs to serve. Whoever can meet our high standards should be allowed to serve. So that was great. I was pretty excited. I'm like, here we have the Secretary of Defense, who's the head of the Pentagon under President Obama, endorsing the right of Sikhs to serve, and hopefully I'm going to get an accommodation. So we followed up with the Pentagon, no response back from them, right? So between December and April, nothing happened. So in April of 2016, I get pulled into a meeting with my commander here in Massachusetts. And I'll never forget it, but it was a big formation, and they're like, hey, Specialist Singh, the commander wants to see you. And I'm like, oh no, because you don't get called out for good reasons. You typically get called out for bad reasons. So part of me is like, I don't know what's going to happen. I mean, kind of had a sense of what was going to happen. And by that time, they allowed me to join the unit and serve because they wanted me to get some training before shipping off for basic training. But I was still training in civilian clothes, by the way, not the official issued uniform that they had issued out to other people.
And that's not common practice, right?
No, it was not common at all. So by the way, all of this made it's to the lawsuit, because we talked about it in terms of how I was being treated differently and this whole discrimination aspect. So I didn't realize it at the time, but even though the whole experience was awful, I would not wish it on anyone, but it actually solidified our case.
Right.
So the commander pulls me aside, and I show up to his office and I salute him, right? Because I'm standing in front of a captain. And I'm like, sir, Specialist Singh reporting as requested. How can I help you? And he's like, well, Specialist Singh, I hate to ask you this question, but I already know the answer to it. Would you be willing to cut your hair and shave if we sent you to basic training? And I took a pause, because part of me was upset and aggravated, because you would never ask a Sikh to cut your hair or shave or remove our articles of faith, because that's like chopping off a limb, right? You wouldn't do that. We literally died fighting for the right to practice our religion.
Right.
I took a deep breath and I paused, and I looked him in the eye, and I was very blunt, and I said, listen, sir, with all due respect, you wear your uniform as a US soldier. As a Sikh, I wear my uniform and my articles of faith, because that's who I am. And Sikhs have died throughout our history fighting in our articles of faith. And so there's no way I'm cutting my hair or shave. He's like, well, Specialist Singh, I was expecting that answer. I just got a phone call from some very high-ranking person, and I'll relay that message back to them. And so I went back home later that evening, and I called my legal team, and I explained what had happened, the folks at Sikh Coalition, and they basically said, can you come over to New York in 2 days, and because we'll have to discuss some next steps. I show up, and then we decided over there we're going to file a lawsuit. And look, when I started this journey, I was hoping we would not have to file a lawsuit, because the last thing I wanted was having to use the court, right? So we wanted to use diplomatic ways, through members of Congress, through the executive branch, the judiciary. Was not something I was hoping we'd have to use to allow me to serve. But that was the only avenue at that point. My shipping date was coming up, and so we filed a lawsuit, which folks who are listening can look it up. It's called Singh versus McConville. And so a few weeks after the case was filed, the army backtracked and issued me and two other Sikhs who were on that lawsuit an interim religious accommodation. And that allowed me and the two other folks to go attend basic training, and then that accommodation was made permanent a few months later.
Wow, it was almost a year, right? The whole process from when you signed to when you got the accommodation.
Yeah.
How was that on you mentally and emotionally? Like, was it difficult to deal with? I imagine so, but.
In hindsight, it should have been difficult, right? But in the moment, I just knew the cause and the purpose of what I was doing was justified. So it didn't really give me any level of anxiety or stress. I mean, there was certainly a little bit of stress around, hey, what can go wrong? But I was like, whatever. I mean, if it happens, it happens.
Right.
I just believed so strongly in the cause that I was even ready to go to jail, frankly. If they had, I mean, I was ready. I mean, I was mentally ready. If they had asked me to cut my hair and shave and given me an order, which I would have refused to carry out, they could have put me in jail. And I was ready for that. And certainly that's why I say I was a lot younger and able to take certain risks back then than I would take now. So
yeah, but I mean that is also Sikh tradition, right? I mean, Guru Arjan Dev Ji, Guru Har Gobind Sahib, like they willingly, Guru Tegh Bahadur Ji willingly give themselves for the sake of defending our right to practice our Sikhi. And so you're just following in that tradition,
right.
It's evident. I feel like this is pretty common for Sikhs, is even if we don't realize it, a lot of the ways we behave are just following in the tradition of our gurus and our ancestors who have literally given their heads instead of their hair. And that's what always sticks with me about being a Sikh. But you'd mentioned, this, they have these, what was the word? Policies, the policy of, for keeping your hair and everything. So do you understand the reason for uniformity in the military? Like, I just want to kind of play that other perspective, right? As someone that this system of the government or this element, they have these rules, they have these policies, but this particular one of this uniformity of everybody must be clean shaven and have their hair cut. Do you understand it? Do you see the merit? Does it make sense to you?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I'll get to that, but I do want to touch on the point you made earlier, now, which is, what the Sikh gurus, and I agree with you 100%, because as you know, in Sikhi, we talk about nirbhav and nirvair, which are two essential concepts around no fear and no hate, right? And I think having that sort of basis as Sikhs really makes you fearless, right? And I always think of some of the things that I've done personally in life, which in hindsight are pretty risky, and maybe other people would not have done it, but you're like, man, no fear, no hate. If it feels right, you go do it, right? And so I think that definitely drove the things that I did back then personally. Now, to answer your question around uniformity, I do think the military is different from other careers and professions. And ours is a dangerous job, by the way, and it's a stressful job, especially if you're in combat. I have not been in combat, right? But we do train for combat. And when people are sleep deprived and they're stressed, they're anxious, they have weapons, loaded weapons on them, crazy things can happen. And I've seen some of those things happen, by the way, with people having mental health issues or breakdowns or becoming suicidal because they just cannot handle the stress that you go through during the process of becoming a soldier, right? So the rules and the regulations that exist, I do believe they exist for a reason, right?
Sure.
So one of the rules, for example, that we have is everyone should be able to run in a certain amount of time.
Okay.
And they should be able to do a certain amount of physical activity, right? They should be able to shoot weapons. They
Right.
should be able to throw grenades. They should be able to carry out certain tasks. As an officer, you go through additional training because you're not just a soldier at that point, but you're a leader. And so you should be able to lead soldiers in stressful situations. So as an officer, I have been graded to do certain things because that can happen in a potential mission where I have to lead, for example, a convoy of military vehicles, and we may get under attack. And if we get under attack, how do we get out of that, and how do we ensure the men and women who are under my command can get home safely, right?
Sure.
So there are certain rules and regulations that do exist for a reason. The whole uniformity thing, I think, is kind of interesting because the reasons that the military used to keep me out were the same reasons that the military had used to keep Black people, Hispanic people, women, gays, lesbians out of the military. And so the things that we heard when we filed the lawsuit, well, if we let Sikhs serve with their articles of faith, it's going to impact morale and unit cohesion and esprit de corps. And I mean, it seemed based on the military's response that the whole world would fall apart if we just allowed Sikhs to serve with our articles of faith. And by the way, what was interesting was the military had given accommodations for folks with medical reasons. So there's some people, predominantly Black people and Hispanic people, who cannot shave for medical reasons. They end up getting some bumps on their skin if they end up shaving. So the military was issuing medical profiles for people to have beards. By the way, the whole uniformity thing, people had tattoos, right? So the military didn't stop people from getting tattoos, even though they would stand out with tattoos, right? Women could serve. So women are look different than men. So if you want uniformity, then why are women serving? Well, the military is like, oh no, we want women, we like women, so we can allow them to serve, right? And then the worst example of the uniformity thing was special forces personnel were allowed to not having to follow grooming standards. So they were literally serving at the time in Iraq and Afghanistan, growing bigger beards than you and I, walking around with long hair. I mean, so if these special forces soldiers and airmen, Marines, and sailors could operate without having to follow these grooming standards, why the heck are you forcing these grooming standards on everyone else? Mm-hmm. And then one final thing that they were using against us, well, you would not be able to seal a gas mask if you have a beard. And we knew that theory actually has been disproven. It's just the military did not want people knowing that gas masks actually do work with beards. Mm-hmm. But so they had just created this, bunch of reasons to keep us out. And then, you can say whatever you want, right? Outside of court. But once you file a lawsuit, everything has to be factual, right? Mm-hmm. And I think this is one of the strengths we have in the US. We have a strong judicial system. And so you can have hearsay, but when it comes to lawsuits, everything has to be factual. Mm-hmm. And I think the DOD knew that their case had no merit whatsoever. Mm-hmm. And this is why, and I think the judge saw that. And I think I wasn't part of the proceedings, but based on what I've heard, the judge was quite shocked to see how I had been treated, how other Sikhs who were trying to join had been treated, and the fact that the military at the time had no reason whatsoever to keep Sikhs out.
Yeah, that's it seems like a lot of just like a very feeble attempts to stop what really I don't think impacts. I mean, as you said earlier on, like if anybody knows Sikhs, they either know us for our like seva, our selfless service or charity work, or because we're fierce warriors. And never has that image impacted people's, like our physical appearance impacted people's view of us as warriors. So it is strange that they would, that's the point they bring up of like morale and, inability to act or like function similarly. So yeah, it's so strange. But I know we'd actually talked about this, and there's been a story recently, and so I wanted to ask you, how much progress do you feel still needs to be made with the military accepting Sikhi and other faiths' beliefs?
Yeah. Look, one of the things that I'm most proud of is the work we did back in 2014 through 2016 paid off, because now in the Army, Air Force, and the Navy, there is a process to request religious accommodations. I have run into hundreds of people who now have access to religious accommodations, permanent religious accommodations, by the way. And they're not just Sikhs, by the way. There are Sikhs, Muslims, Christians, Jews, pagans, Buddhists, and folks of other religious groups. I'll never forget it. I was in Georgia last year for a training, and I'm running, and I'm kind of running late to a training, so I didn't want anyone interrupting me. But this guy stopped me. He's like, "Are you Lieutenant Singh?" And I'm like, "Yeah, who are you, man?" And he saluted me, and I'm like, I saluted him back. He's like, "Sir, I have a religious accommodation because of you, and I want to thank you for that."
Wow.
And I gave him my number, because again, I was running late. I didn't want to be late to formation. I'm like, "Hey, let's catch up, because I would love to hear more." And he was a pagan who had gotten a religious accommodation for his articles of faith, and which he would not have had otherwise. And I was really, happy to see that, because if we want full warriors, no one should have to hide their religious beliefs. There are Christians, for example, who have long hair and beards. There are some, African American women now who don't have to straighten their hair and keep their hair in a natural texture and natural form, because after we've went through our accommodation process, the military said, "You know what? Some of these antiquated policies don't make a whole lot of sense in 21st century. Who are the other groups who could benefit from changes to AR 670-1? Women, not just African American women, but all women today in the Army can grow a ponytail, and they don't need to have a bun, which can cause headaches to women." Wow. And so a lot of that was triggered by the work that Sikhs did. We did, because we were at the forefront of fighting for changes to AR 670-1. And luckily, the military looked at it, and they took an end-to-end view, and they made changes as they should have. Far earlier, they should have done that, but they didn't. But, so it took us, our work, to get to that point. So I always have a smile when I see someone who's gotten an accommodation, or they can grow ponytails, or they don't need to, straighten their hair. Because again, if you can get the mission done, why are you forcing people to do something that is not good for them, right? And if they can meet the high standards, that's all that matters. If someone can move, run, shoot, can meet our fitness standards, to me, that's all that matters. It doesn't matter what they look like, the color of their skin, their religion, their sexual orientation, who they love, and where they come from, right? If they can sign the dotted line and volunteer to serve in our nation's military and put themselves in harm's way when we get to that point, and they're trained and professionally proficient to do their job, that's all that matters. That's all that I think the military should care about, in my opinion. So then, to answer your question, the progress has been made, but we still have struggles in certain areas. I think the one case that has come up recently is that for the Marine Corps. The Marine Corps is the last branch that is still not allowing for religious accommodation. And so I must give some of your audience historical perspective here, because the Marine Corps was also the last branch to allow Black people to serve. The Marine Corps was also the last branch to allow women to serve in combat roles. And yet again, sadly, they are the last branch that's preventing Sikhs from, fully serving, and not just Sikhs, all religious minorities and folks who need religious accommodations. So there's been a case that's come out of Lieutenant who joined the Marine Corps, enlisted 5 years ago or so, and he sadly cut his hair and shaved at the time, and he did not want that, but that was the only option for him to become a Marine. And then recently he realized that, hey, I can't just keep serving like this. I need to be able to grow my articles of faith. And so he requested the religious accommodation, and the Marine Corps basically told him no. or they gave him a very limited accommodation, but it's not a full thing.
Mhm.
I think he's in a very similar situation like I was back in 2014 and 2015. And so I have a lot of respect for him, and I'm a strong advocate, and I hope the Marine Corps gives him a full religious accommodation, because again, as we've talked about, there's no rhyme or reason why the Marine Corps should not keep someone like Lieutenant Sukhtur, who is a great Marine, by the way, and he's done an honorable job serving, to be able to grow his beard and hair and wear his articles of faith. The world is not going to fall apart. Trust me. That's a message I'll have for the Marine Corps. Because look, I serve in the Army, and the Army said the same thing. And I'm not saying this with pride or ego, but I have been able to do things in the Army and get recognized for that I would not have been able to do as a junior officer. Right?
Mm-hmm.
If I can do certain things, and the Army has realized I can, and I can be an asset to the mission, they want me, and they want people like me. In fact, one of the questions I get from some of the generals I get to work with is, are there more people like you that we can get? And I tell them, listen, you made such a big deal when I was trying to join back then. And so my hope is, again, the Marine Corps learns from Sikhs in other branches, who I believe have done a phenomenal job, and not just Sikhs, but folks with other religious, because as you know now, it's not just about Sikhs, right? We talk about Sarbat da Pala. So I take a lot of pride in others, religious minorities.
It means the well-being of all. Sarbat Pala, for anybody that doesn't know, just wanted to.
Yes, well-being of all. So I think the Marine Corps would tremendously benefit, in my humble opinion, from allowing all Marines to be able to get religious accommodations.
So this has been an awesome conversation. Thank you so much for sharing. Before I close it, though, I do want to ask, what advice have you gotten that you found to be the most rewarding?
During the struggle to serve with my articles of faith, I looked a lot, not just at Sikh history, but also the US civil rights movement. And so I was inspired a lot by the journeys and the struggles of people like Dr. King and Rosa Parks and Representative John Lewis, who we sadly lost last year. In fact, I actually met Representative John Lewis in San Francisco at a conference in 2016. And I remember having goosebumps when I saw the man. And by the way, he was a very petite man, right? And I thought he was going to be a lot taller and bigger, because this guy had changed the course of history. But here's this petite, bald man, and I had goosebumps when I've never had an experience like that ever again in my life. And that person had there was a team obviously, but despite having almost been killed for fighting for equal rights and justice, he continued to march on. And throughout his life and his career, he stood for people who didn't have a voice. And that's what I admire and appreciated and respect about the Black people and the allies of the Black people who had supported and fought for the U.S. civil rights movement, and that fight continues, because as we know, U.S. is not a perfect country, but hopefully we will continue to go down that path and create an equal opportunities country for all people, all our people. So I think the biggest takeaway for me, and perhaps this is a longer answer than you were looking for, is find your purpose in life. Right. And find what you're passionate about and fight for that. Right. So, someone like Dr. King and Rosa Parks and Representative John Lewis, they could have easily quit, but they knew their purpose. They knew if they fought for equal rights, if they fought for justice, that wouldn't just impact them, that would impact generations from now. Right. And so despite how bad it got, and the fact that some of them died and some of them were beat up pretty badly, they continued down that path. And I think we learned the same thing from the Sikh history, right? Yes. Our gurus taught us that Our gurus taught us that you don't give up, you don't quit, regardless of how hard, how tough life gets. And I think that's the message I would have. And that's been the most inspiring aspect for me is, find your purpose and find why you're passionate about it and try to live that purpose-driven life. So, back in 2014, 2015, I knew there were a lot of risks with what I was doing, but that was the purpose. And, I would have probably done the same thing if I was in that same situation today. Probably wouldn't have done, the riskier things that I did back then, such as, publicly asking Secretary of Defense what he thought about Sikhs in the military. But hey, it was a means to an end, right?
Yeah.
And so I even to this day, when I struggle personally, I always ask myself, hey, what's my purpose and what am I trying to accomplish? Who am I trying to help? What kind of impact I'll have on other people if I can get this thing done, let's say on the civilian side or on the military side. So.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I know you said you wouldn't do it maybe now, but when you told me that story, that incident, all I thought about was like the way our gurus speak to emperors and have spoken to kings, and just the fearlessness, as you mentioned before, just the willingness to stand up and speak for what they feel is right, and that's the freedom for people to identify as they do and practice and live that life. So that was a great answer response. I love it. It's a perfect way to really just end this podcast. Where can people find you on social media?
Yeah, look, they can connect with me on TikTok. Sikh Soldier is my handle, and they can also connect with me on Instagram. They can look me up, Kanwar Singh. Kanwar91 is my Instagram account. But yeah, I invite people to connect. I love meeting people and connecting and hearing stories of how I can help them or how they've been impacted or influenced by some of the things that I've done. And it's an amazing community out there. So yeah, I look forward to connecting with people.
Yeah, if you don't follow him on TikTok, the whole reason I even invited him was because he shares his experience as a Sikh that's also part of the military. And I think that was an important perspective that I wanted to provide, because the people have been asking me questions about that, and I don't have the knowledge and experience to answer it. I can give historical stuff, but I can't really talk about what it's like for a Sikh in the military. So this was very insightful for me, hopefully for the audience as well. Thank you again for taking part in this conversation and being my first guest for the Rooted in Sikhi podcast. I really appreciate your time. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.